When Pastor Williams walked across the raging Colorado River without getting his feet wet, the people of Millfield called it a miracle. But they had no idea that his seemingly ordinary boots had been crafted by Tobias Kane, the cobbler whose leather defied the laws of nature. For 15 years, Tobias had been creating footwear that allowed people to walk on water, climb vertical walls, and step through solid rock. And his impossible craftsmanship was about to change the fate of the American frontier forever. But to understand how a simple shoe cobbler became the most powerful and dangerous craftsman in the American West, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to a winter night in 1858, when Tobias Kane first learned that some materials demand prices that go far beyond gold or silver, and some craftsmanship requires sacrifices that can damn a man's soul for eternity. Tobias Kane arrived in Millfield, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1857 as a young man of 25 carrying nothing but a set of cobbler's tools inherited from his grandfather and knowledge of leatherworking techniques that had been passed down through 7 generations of his family. The Kane bloodline had been crafting shoes and boots in the mountains of Scotland for over 2 centuries, developing methods and understanding materials in ways that seemed to border on the supernatural. The skills that Tobias brought to the American frontier were far more sophisticated than anything most people had ever encountered. He could work with leather types that other cobblers couldn't even identify, using techniques that produced footwear so durable and perfectly fitted that customers would travel hundreds of miles to commission a pair of his boots. His understanding of how different materials interacted with human anatomy was so advanced that he could create shoes that would prevent injuries, correct walking problems, and allow people to traverse terrain that would be impossible in ordinary footwear. Millfield in the 1850s was a rapidly growing mining town that attracted ambitious prospectors, experienced miners, and support businesses from across the country. The community needed skilled craftsmen who could provide the specialized equipment and services that frontier life demanded, and Tobias's reputation as a master cobbler spread quickly throughout Colorado Territory. But Tobias's family legacy included more than just exceptional craftsmanship skills. The Kane family had been guardians of ancient knowledge about materials and techniques that existed at the boundaries between natural science and supernatural power. His grandfather, Malcolm Kane, had been known throughout the Scottish Highlands as a man who could create footwear that allowed people to walk safely across treacherous mountain terrain, ford dangerous rivers, and travel through conditions that would be fatal in ordinary shoes. The source of the Kane family's extraordinary abilities was a collection of materials and tools that had been accumulated over generations of leatherworking. Hidden in a secret compartment of Tobias's tool chest were substances that didn't appear in any conventional textbook on tanning or leather treatment. Powders made from ground minerals that could only be found in specific cave systems, oils extracted from plants that grew only in certain atmospheric conditions, and thread spun from fibers that seemed to possess properties that defied conventional understanding of textiles. Most importantly, Tobias possessed knowledge of rituals and techniques that transformed ordinary leather working into something approaching alchemy. The process of creating truly supernatural footwear required more than just skillful craftsmanship. It demanded the precise application of forces and energies that existed beyond the normal world of physical materials. Tobias's first indication that his inherited knowledge might be more powerful than he had realized came in the winter of 1858, when a desperate miner named Jacob Morrison approached him with an impossible request. Morrison had discovered a rich silver vein in a cave system that was partially flooded with underground water. The deposit could make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but accessing it would require walking across an underground lake that was too deep to wade through and too wide to cross with any conventional bridge or boat. Morrison had heard stories about the Kane family's legendary craftsmanship and wondered whether Tobias might be able to create waterproof boots that would allow him to work in the flooded cave. What Morrison didn't realize was that he was asking for footwear that would need to provide far more than simple waterproofing. He needed boots that would allow him to walk on the surface of water itself. Under normal circumstances, Tobias would have explained that such a request was impossible and suggested alternative solutions for Morrison's mining problem. But something about the miner's desperation and the description of the silver deposit triggered memories of stories his grandfather had told him about the most advanced techniques in the Kane family tradition, methods that could create footwear capable of defying the natural laws that govern human movement. The process that Tobias used to create Morrison's water-walking boots was unlike anything he had ever attempted before. Working in secret during the long winter nights, he began combining materials and techniques that pushed his inherited knowledge to its absolute limits. The leather he used came from animals that had been exposed to specific atmospheric conditions during their lives. The treatment process involved substances that had been prepared according to formulas that dated back centuries. Most importantly, the construction required rituals that seemed to tap into forces that existed beyond the physical world. The boots that Tobias created for Morrison looked absolutely ordinary from the outside. Well-made leather footwear that could have been crafted by any skilled cobbler. But when Morrison put them on and stepped onto the surface of the underground lake, something impossible happened. The water supported his weight as if it were solid ground, allowing him to walk across the surface without sinking or even getting his feet wet. Morrison's success in accessing the flooded silver deposit made him one of the wealthiest men in Colorado territory within a matter of months. But more importantly for Tobias, it proved that the most advanced techniques in his family's tradition could be successfully applied in the American frontier environment. The materials and energies that his ancestors had worked with in Scotland were available in the mountains of Colorado, and the rituals that had seemed like ancient superstition were actually sophisticated methods for manipulating forces that most people couldn't perceive or understand. Word of Morrison's miraculous success spread quickly through the mining community, but the explanation for his achievement was carefully concealed. Morrison understood that revealing the true source of his water-walking ability would either result in people thinking he was insane or create dangerous competition for Tobias's services. Instead, he attributed his success to innovative mining techniques and good fortune, while quietly arranging for other desperate miners to meet with the cobbler who had made his impossible achievement possible. Over the following years, Tobias began receiving requests for footwear that would allow people to perform feats that challenged the laws of physics and human anatomy. Miners wanted boots that would let them walk on vertical rock faces to access deposits in impossible locations. Ranchers needed shoes that would allow them to step through quicksand or cross frozen rivers without breaking through the ice. Travelers sought footwear that would let them traverse mountain terrain that was normally impassable for human beings. Each new commission required Tobias to push his inherited knowledge further, experimenting with materials and techniques that were increasingly dangerous and supernatural. He learned to create boots that could allow people to walk through solid rock, shoes that would let wearers climb sheer cliff faces as easily as walking on level ground, and footwear that could carry people across surfaces that would normally be unable to support human weight. But as Tobias's abilities advanced, he began to understand that the power he was manipulating came with prices that went far beyond the materials and time required for his craftsmanship. The forces that allowed his footwear to defy natural laws were connected to entities and energies that existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception. And these supernatural powers demanded payment that could only be satisfied through increasingly dangerous sacrifices. The first clear indication that Tobias's work was attracting malevolent attention came in 1862, when several people who had purchased his supernatural footwear began experiencing disturbing side effects. Customers reported that their boots seemed to develop minds of their own, leading them to locations they hadn't intended to visit and compelling them to perform actions that were completely out of character. More troubling, some people found that removing the boots became increasingly difficult, as if the footwear was somehow bonding with their bodies and influencing their behavior. Tobias realized that the entities providing power for his supernatural craftsmanship were not simply tools to be used for human benefit. They were intelligent forces with their own agendas and motivations. The boots he was creating weren't just defying natural laws. They were serving as conduits that allowed supernatural entities to influence and manipulate the people who wore them. The moral complexity of this discovery was agonizing for Tobias. His footwear was genuinely helping people accomplish things that would otherwise be impossible, allowing them to access resources, escape dangerous situations, and achieve goals that could transform their lives and communities. But the supernatural assistance came with the risk of exposing wearers to forms of manipulation and corruption that could ultimately destroy their humanity and free will. The crisis that would force Tobias to confront the true nature of his abilities came in 1863, when Pastor Williams approached him with a request that seemed both holy and impossible. Williams had been called to minister to a group of pioneers who were trapped on the far side of the Colorado River during the spring flood season. The river was running too high and fast for any conventional crossing, but the pioneers were facing starvation and disease that would kill them within days if they didn't receive assistance. Williams had heard rumors about Tobias's extraordinary footwear and wondered whether the cobbler might be able to create boots that would allow him to cross the dangerous river and provide spiritual and practical assistance to the trapped families. What Williams didn't understand was that he was asking for footwear that would need to allow him to walk on the surface of one of the most dangerous rivers in Colorado territory during its most treacherous season. The request presented Tobias with a moral dilemma that tested everything he believed about the purpose and consequences of his supernatural craftsmanship. Creating water-walking boots for Pastor Williams could save the lives of innocent families, but it would also require tapping into the same supernatural forces that had been corrupting other customers and potentially exposing a holy man to demonic influences that could corrupt his soul. Tobias's decision revealed both his compassion and his growing understanding of how to work with supernatural forces without being completely dominated by them. Instead of creating boots that would give Williams complete power over water, he developed footwear that would provide just enough supernatural assistance to allow the pastor to cross the river safely while minimizing the risk of spiritual corruption. The boots that Tobias created for Pastor Williams were his most sophisticated work to date, incorporating protective elements that would shield the wearer from the worst effects of supernatural influence while still providing the miraculous abilities needed to accomplish the rescue mission. The leather was treated with substances that had protective as well as empowering properties. The construction included symbols and materials that would serve as barriers against malevolent entities. Most importantly, the footwear was designed to function only for the specific purpose of saving innocent lives, making it less attractive to the supernatural forces that thrived on human corruption and suffering. When Pastor Williams stepped onto the surface of the raging Colorado River and walked across its surface as if it were solid ground, the people of Millfield witnessed what appeared to be a genuine miracle. The pastor reached the trapped pioneers, provided them with food and medical supplies, and guided them to safety through a series of impossible river crossings that saved 23 lives, including 7 children who would have died without his intervention. But the most remarkable aspect of Williams's mission was that he emerged from the experience spiritually strengthened rather than corrupted. The protective elements that Tobias had incorporated into the boots had successfully shielded the pastor from the negative effects of supernatural power, allowing him to perform miraculous feats while maintaining his moral integrity and spiritual purity. The success of Pastor Williams's mission transformed Tobias's understanding of his abilities and responsibilities. He realized that supernatural power didn't have to be inherently corrupting if it was used with wisdom, proper preparation, and genuine commitment to helping others rather than pursuing personal gain or power. Over the following years, Tobias began developing techniques for creating protective supernatural footwear that could provide extraordinary abilities while minimizing the risks of spiritual corruption. He learned to work with benevolent supernatural forces rather than simply trying to exploit malevolent ones. And he developed methods for screening customers to ensure that his most powerful creations would only be used by people with pure motivations. The reputation of Tobias's miraculous footwear spread throughout the American West, but the true nature of his abilities remained a carefully guarded secret. People spoke of the cobbler whose boots could take you anywhere and help you accomplish impossible things. But few understood that they were describing supernatural craftsmanship that operated at the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Tobias's most challenging commission came in 1867, when he was approached by a group of federal agents who needed footwear that would allow them to pursue criminals who had been using supernatural assistance to escape justice. A network of outlaws had gained access to occult knowledge that allowed them to perform impossible escapes, walking through walls, disappearing into thin air, and traveling across terrain that should have been impassable. Conventional law enforcement methods were completely ineffective against criminals who could literally defy the laws of physics. The federal agent's request presented Tobias with complex moral and practical challenges. Creating law enforcement footwear that could match the supernatural abilities of the criminals would require tapping into extremely powerful forces that could be dangerous for the agents who would use them. More importantly, providing such capabilities to government officials could lead to the abuse of supernatural power for political purposes rather than legitimate law enforcement. Tobias's solution was to create footwear that would provide federal agents with supernatural tracking abilities rather than general miraculous powers. The boots he crafted would allow agents to follow supernatural trails left by criminals using occult methods, but they wouldn't provide the kind of general reality-defying abilities that could be easily abused for corrupt purposes. The law enforcement boots that Tobias created were instrumental in dismantling several criminal networks that had been using supernatural methods to terrorize frontier communities. Federal agents wearing his footwear were able to track down outlaws who had previously been untouchable, leading to arrests and prosecutions that brought justice to victims of crimes that had seemed impossible to solve. But the success of the federal law enforcement operation also attracted unwanted attention to Tobias's activities. Government officials began to realize that the cobbler in Millfield possessed abilities that could have significant strategic and military applications, and they started pressuring him to create supernatural footwear for broader government use. The pressure from federal authorities created the most dangerous period of Tobias's career. Government agents made it clear that his supernatural craftsmanship skills were too valuable to remain in private hands, and they began taking steps to force him to work exclusively for government purposes. The threat was not just to Tobias's freedom, but to his ability to continue using his gifts to help ordinary people who needed miraculous assistance to survive the harsh realities of frontier life. Tobias's response to government pressure revealed both his ingenuity and his commitment to using his abilities for humanitarian rather than political purposes. Instead of accepting government control or fleeing to avoid forced service, he chose to make his supernatural craftsmanship abilities appear to be declining and eventually disappearing entirely. Working in secret, Tobias began creating a series of decoy boots that would appear to possess supernatural abilities but would actually fail at critical moments. Government agents testing these deliberately defective creations would conclude that the cobbler's miraculous powers were fading, making him less valuable for official purposes while allowing him to continue his real work, helping people who genuinely needed supernatural assistance. The deception required extraordinary skill and careful planning, but it successfully convinced federal authorities that Tobias's supernatural abilities were unreliable and not suitable for important government operations. After several months of testing apparently defective footwear, the agents concluded that the cobbler's reputation had been exaggerated and that his skills were insufficient for serious military or law enforcement applications. With government pressure removed, Tobias was able to return to his true calling of helping people who faced impossible challenges that could only be overcome through supernatural assistance. But his experience with federal authorities had taught him important lessons about the need to protect his abilities from exploitation and the importance of working carefully to avoid attracting dangerous attention from people who would misuse supernatural power. The final chapter of Tobias's active career began in 1871, when he received a request that would test all of his accumulated knowledge and wisdom about supernatural craftsmanship. A group of pioneers who had been trapped by an early winter in the Rocky Mountains needed footwear that would allow them to traverse conditions that were normally fatal for human beings. The pioneers included families with small children, elderly people, and individuals with medical conditions that made them particularly vulnerable to extreme cold and difficult terrain. The rescue mission would require Tobias to create multiple pairs of supernatural footwear that could provide protection against freezing temperatures, allow people to walk safely across snow and ice, and enable the group to cover distances that would normally be impossible for people in their condition. Most challenging of all, the footwear would need to work reliably for people who had no experience with supernatural abilities and no understanding of the forces they would be manipulating. The boots that Tobias created for the mountain rescue were his masterpiece of protective supernatural craftsmanship. Each pair was individually designed for the specific needs of its intended wearer, incorporating multiple layers of supernatural protection and assistance. The footwear would not only allow people to traverse impossible terrain, but would also provide warmth, energy, and healing that could keep them alive during the dangerous journey to safety. The rescue operation was completely successful, with all 47 trapped pioneers reaching safety through a series of impossible mountain crossings that would have been fatal without supernatural assistance. More importantly, none of the rescued people experienced any negative effect from using supernatural footwear, demonstrating that Tobias had finally mastered the techniques for providing miraculous abilities without spiritual corruption. But the success of the mountain rescue also marked the end of Tobias's career as a creator of supernatural footwear. The effort required to craft so many sophisticated protective items had exhausted his physical and spiritual resources, and he realized that he no longer possessed the energy needed to safely work with the powerful forces that his abilities required. Tobias Kane spent his final years in Millfield training a small group of carefully selected apprentices in the basic techniques of supernatural craftsmanship, though none of them ever achieved the level of ability that had made him legendary throughout the American West. He died peacefully in 1889 at the age of 57. Surrounded by people whose lives had been saved by the impossible footwear he had created over 3 decades of miraculous work. The workshop where Tobias had crafted his supernatural boots was preserved as a memorial to his contributions to the community, but the most powerful tools and materials he had used were buried with him according to his final instructions. He had decided that the knowledge needed to create truly miraculous footwear was too dangerous to pass on to future generations, and that his death should mark the end of an era in supernatural craftsmanship. The boots that Tobias had created continued to function for years after his death, allowing their wearers to perform impossible feats and survive dangerous situations. But gradually, as the supernatural energies that powered them were exhausted through use, the miraculous footwear became ordinary leather goods that served as reminders of a craftsman who had bridged the gap between the natural and supernatural worlds. The legacy of Tobias Kane's work lived on in the stories told throughout the American West about the cobbler, whose boots could take you anywhere and help you accomplish anything. Travelers would speak of footwear that had allowed them to cross raging rivers, climb impossible cliffs, and traverse terrain that should have been fatal. But few people understood that these stories were describing genuine supernatural craftsmanship rather than exaggerated frontier legends. Modern historians who have studied the documented accounts of impossible rescues, miraculous escapes, and death-defying feats in Colorado Territory during the 1860s and 1870s have noted patterns that suggest some form of advanced technology or supernatural assistance was involved. But they have no framework for understanding that these extraordinary achievements were made possible by a shoe cobbler whose inherited knowledge allowed him to create footwear that defied the laws of physics. The people who were saved by Tobias's supernatural footwear went on to establish families, build communities, and contribute to the development of the American West in ways that would have been impossible without his miraculous assistance. Their success served as a testament to the value of his work and the importance of using extraordinary abilities to help others rather than pursuing personal power or gain. In the end, Tobias Kane's greatest achievement was not the supernatural powers he mastered or the impossible footwear he created. It was his understanding that miraculous abilities come with moral responsibilities that extend far beyond the immediate effects of their use. His commitment to helping others, protecting his customers from spiritual corruption, and using his gifts for humanitarian rather than selfish purposes made him one of the most effective forces for good in the history of the American frontier. The shoe cobbler who made boots for walking on water had indeed defied the laws of nature. But more importantly, he had demonstrated that supernatural power could be used to serve love rather than fear, hope rather than despair, and life rather than death. His impossible footwear had carried people not just across rivers and mountains, but across the gap between human limitation and divine possibility. The workshop in Millfield where Tobias had created his miraculous boots eventually became a shrine for people seeking help with impossible challenges, even though no one there could create supernatural footwear anymore. Visitors would leave offerings and prayers, hoping that some trace of the cobbler's power might still linger in the place where he had worked his miracles. And sometimes, just sometimes, people would swear that they could still feel something extraordinary in that old workshop, a sense that the boundary between possible and impossible was thinner there than anywhere else, and that the spirit of a craftsman who had devoted his life to helping others might still be working to make miracles possible for those who needed them most. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of supernatural craftsmanship and miraculous heroism, subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the American frontier. In the comments below, let us know what you think about Tobias's decision to use supernatural powers to help others. Was he right to risk spiritual corruption for the chance to save lives? Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking story of ordinary people who gained extraordinary abilities in the untamed West.